Hello, everyone. Can you see me from behind here? Okay, I'll come out up front. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you for this opportunity to share with you some of our work. I wanted to just start out by saying that it's a privilege and an honor to be part of the launch of the Varela Lecture Series and to be involved in the celebration of Naropa. And Naropa as an institution for me is not only an inspiration, but really an aspirational educational model for many other universities, for me and my colleagues, when we intend to figure out how it is that you can use contemplative practices and training to really scaffold the educational process. So I want to just begin my talk really with a deep sense of gratitude, not only to the founders of Naropa, but to the current faculty and leadership that are allowing Naropa to continue to blossom after 40 years, and I'm hoping many, many more. So I just wanted to start on that note. As well, if you could go to the next slide, as well as a comment about Francisco Varela that Charlotta mentioned. Did you hear me? Next, please. We're going to have to do this next. You guys are going to have to be, it's going to be like Morse code. There we go. So I wanted to mention Francisco Varela because as a scientist, he is somebody that I feel quite indebted to. He initiated and really spearheaded the first conversations between Buddhists and scientists. And he really set forth and charted a course for what I would consider now my growing sense of a home field, which is contemplative neuroscience. So it's really with a deep bow of gratitude that I'd like to just launch our conversation tonight. If you could go to the next slide, please. So my topic, as it says in my title, is Mindfulness and Neuroscience, Befriending the Mind. And I wanted to make a comment about this term, befriending. The program of research that I've been involved in my own laboratory is around how it is that mindfulness can connect to neuroscience, what we can know about the neural basis, the brain basis of what mindfulness training might do. And the befriending is around what we think might be part of what happens to us as we engage in a contemplative path in our own relationship with our mind. So if you can go to the next slide. And one way I think about this is really to use the more familiar term of what a friend is. And I like this small quote by Hubbard, which is, "A friend is one who knows you and loves you just the same." And these qualities of really knowing and loving, to me, are real endpoints and actually part of the journey of what contemplative practice is. Would you agree? Yeah. So in the context of my work as a neuroscientist who uses attention and studies the brain's attention system, the goal was to see how we can understand how attention plays a role in the contemplative path. But it ends up that, attention is kind of a funny thing. It's really quite hard to keep it still long enough to be able to know it and love it. And I think this was described probably best by kind of the founding father of modern psychology, William James, if you go to the next slide. So he says, and I'm going to try to read this without falling off the stage, "The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. An education which should improve this faculty would be an education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than give practical directions for bringing this about." And what I really enjoy about his take on this is, yeah, absolutely, attention may be critical to everything that we are, but we really don't have much of a clue on how to go about taming it. And so the kinds of work that we've been doing is trying to explore ways in which people have attempted to tame a wandering attention. Next, please. So there's many varieties, right? So medication, psychotherapy, more recently computer-based training, and I would put mindfulness training in that same sort of category of potential ways by which we might tame a wandering attention. So you can go to the next one, and then next again. So what is it that I think about when I use the term mindfulness? I think we could probably have a rich discussion if I just spent the rest of the time with everybody kind of engaging on that topic alone. but I wanted to give you my sense of what it is, really in a way that is probably most easy and accessible. It essentially comes out of trying to explain to my children what I do. They're 7 and 11. So when they ask me what mindfulness is, I really do think about it as, if you can just read the sort of description up front, a mental mode characterized by attention to present moment experience without conceptual elaboration or emotional reactivity. That's quite a mouthful that 7-year-olds don't tend to pick up on. So put another way, what I like to say to her is essentially, you know this like MP3 player you've got where you listen to your music? Well, our mind is really like when we put that in fast forward or reverse. Our mind is really good at mental time travel. We can go back and forth, and a lot of times, most of the time in our kind of experience, our mind does that. And when we think about what mindfulness is, in many ways, it's about keeping that button on play to actually show up in the here and the now. And I hope that you would find that to be somewhat of a resonant metaphor in the way that we think about what mindfulness training is. And of course, now the key is to understand what it is about the process of cultivating mindfulness that might lead us toward this taming of a wandering attention. So, next slide, please. Again, in the spirit of kind of all of us being on the same page, I wanted to just state at the outset what a common mindfulness practices or mindfulness exercises, mindfulness of breathing, and highlight some of those central components that, as scientists, give us clues into what it is that we might be training when we ask people to engage in contemplative practice. So the way that we describe it is that, of course, as all of us know, it's simple but not quite easy, with the basic instructions to sit in a relaxed, comfortable, upright position. And then the key is that we are to select the sensations tied to some aspect of our sensory experience of breathing. So that selecting, that honing in on something in particular is the key part of the instruction. And then, of course, to maintain our attention for the period of time that we've decided to engage in formal practice on that selected sensation. So selecting and then maintaining attention are two key aspects. But we also provide instructions on what to do when the mind wanders away, as we all expect it will, and we experience, most of us, that it will, which is pretty straightforward. When you notice it, return your attention back to that sensory selected object. So selection, maintenance, and controlling of mind wandering are all part of this, you might even say, the cognitive aspects of training the attention system. At least that's our hypothesis going into it. And what we've been trying to understand is how is it in particular that this process of engaging in these practices might strengthen our ability to control our own mind wandering, since it is sort of a central part of what is acknowledged in the most fundamental and foundational practices in mindfulness. Next slide. So what is mind wandering? It's been called affectionately by many names, absent-mindedness, monkey mind, lost in thought. Has anybody ever experienced mind wandering? Yeah. So we all have this sort of sense of what that means. But I did want to kind of clarify, again, what we mean when we talk about it from the research perspective, because it is more of a kind of a constrained definition. Next, please. So when we talk about mind wandering, we're talking about having off-task thoughts while you're engaged in a particular task. Okay, so you're trying to do something, and at that moment, when there is an intended goal for what your behavior should be, your mind is off from that. Your attention is off from that. And unfortunately, it has a lot of downsides. So, well, the first thing is that really a lot of times when we engage or are in the midst of mind wandering, the mental content, the conscious experience is of worrying or ruminating. And it also has to do with feeling very distracted or scattered, like there's no hold of where our attentional experience is. There's no kind of coming together of it. And when there are opportunities to vision, sometimes it's catastrophic. It's taking us off from what we're trying to do because we're engaging in, again, part of the worry. So when I use the term mind wandering, I'm talking about you have something you're trying to do, and your attention is off from that. And the consequences are sort of worse than simply that you end up feeling bad, which I think is a very important bad consequence. But it's that it kind of takes you by surprise. You're in the midst of mind wandering without having the awareness or intention to be wandering. Okay? And when you do this, performance on the task you're trying to engage in suffers. because your attention is not at that task. The thing that's really striking, and in some of the work, as Charlotta mentioned, I work with some high-stress cohorts, for example, folks that are in the military. If you are wandering, you actually suppress your brain's ability to pick up incoming sensory information. We would call this perceptual decoupling. It's like the mind is not in the same place as the sensory information that is coming in, which can have, you can imagine, devastating consequences, not only for somebody on a battlefield, but if you're driving your car. So I'm saying this because I want to contrast it with what comes up often when I talk about mind wandering. Next slide. Which is its close cousin, but actually quite different, which we would call daydreaming, or in more journal speak, constructive internal reflection. So this is really when we choose, we willingly, consciously, with awareness, with intention, choose to let our mind wander away from, without any constraints. So it's not wandering away from a task, it's actually allowing the free flow of conscious experience. And this has some very lovely and productive consequences. So creativity, or future planning, or the experience of insight, visioning when it has to do with positive outcomes. These are all tied to what we might call constructive internal reflection. The key difference between that form of the mind wandering around versus what I'm talking about when I use that phrase mind wandering is that the first one, daydreaming, happens with intention and awareness, and mind wandering does not. So the negative consequences or downsides are much more severe under mind wandering when it has to do with wandering away from a task at hand. Okay, so from now on when I use that phrase mind wandering, I'm talking about that, not the other form of creative or generative type of free-flowing of thought. So a few more things that we know about mind wandering that I think make it kind of a fascinating topic of study that happens to actually intersect quite nicely with in contemplative training. We know now from several studies, but probably the most well-known is an experience sampling study done by some colleagues at Harvard, where they gave people a smartphone app that pinged them any time of day and asked them questions about what they were doing and how aware they were of what they were doing. And what that study revealed is that most of the time, in fact, close to 50% of the time, people were mind wandering. So whatever it was they were doing, their mind was not on that. So it's a very prominent part of our experience, of our human experience. And what they also found in that study is that not only was mind wandering associated with negative mood or feeling less happy, it was actually causally related to it. So in time, it was more likely if you had been mind wandering that the next moment you were going to experience a negative emotion, which I think is also quite striking. Most recently, and I think this is where it really makes you see the power of what our mind does on the body. There's been recent studies that connect mind wandering to cellular longevity, how long your cells live. So the end caps of our chromosomes are called telomeres, and telomere length is tied, basically the longer the telomere, the longer the cell's lifespan. And so colleagues at UCSF did a project in which they asked a very large group of very highly stressed people who had chronic stress. Essentially, many of them were caregivers of children with severe disabilities. And what they found is that the stress can have an impact, but what they'd asked them was just a simple paper and pencil questionnaire. How often do you mind wander? Are you experiencing the present moment more, or are you mind wandering? And they had a very nice series of questions, things like, when you take a shower, do you feel the water on your face? And really connecting people with, are they in their moments? What they found is those that actually had very prominent mind wandering had shorter telomere length. Which, I think there's a lot of interesting questions and lines of research that opens up. So mind wandering really happens all the time, is tied to negative mood, and really could be a matter of life and death. So I think it's a compelling topic to study. We're going to just dive into what I want to share with you about my own research program, and we're going to anchor around two questions. The first is, why does mind wandering occur? As I already told you, it's kind of bad news. And then what can we do about it? Now, it is it's late evening on a Friday night. And thankfully, you guys hopefully won't mind wander through this presentation. But in the event that you might, I'm going to give you, if you go to the next slide, please, just the take-home message. Okay, so stay with me. This is not an invitation to wander, but this is where we're going by the end of the talk. So what I will tell you through the course of the next several slides is that mind wandering, when we look at the brain basis for it, seems to be somehow tied to a default way that the brain functions. And it is tied with a state that has to do with constant self-related preoccupations. Okay? So it happens all the time, and it's related to self, and the brain by default sort of looks like it's in this state. The second thing I'm going to tell you is that, yes, we can do something about it, and engaging in contemplative practice seems to change the way the brain functions by default, and it seems to strengthen our ability to pay attention. So that's where we're going, but please stay with me. Next slide, please. So why does mind wandering occur? Next slide. All right, so we have to take a little bit of a history lesson through the beginnings of neuroimaging, if I am to explain to you how we came to know this about the brain. In the early days of brain imaging, our methods were pretty crude, and we really basically were trying to confirm that everything that we learned about the brain through brain lesion studies, where we have people that have large strokes or injury, and tells us a little bit about what parts of the brain are doing what. We wanted to confirm that idea of how the brain is organized holds true when we use these functional MRI technologies. So we do pretty crude experiments that essentially said, okay, we know that we have a pretty strong idea that attentionally demanding tasks require a circuit that involves the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex. The details don't matter. But we have a sense of where we're going to see activity in the brain when we have somebody pay attention. So why don't we have them pay attention for a period of time, and then let's interleave that with telling them just to rest. And what we should see is that when they're paying attention, this attention network should be activated, and it should not be activated during rest. Seemed like a straightforward strategy. And if you go to the next slide, that's essentially what we found. So in blue are the brain regions that were activated in the context of an attentionally demanding task. They were all the usual suspects that we had predicted based on brain lesion studies: frontal cortex, parietal cortex, etc. The thing that surprised everybody was that, it wasn't just the case that when people were told to rest, that the brain was just kind of quiet. It ended up that there was a circuit that was reliably more active during rest, and that was actually, during rest, you were seeing suppression of that attentionally demanding circuit. So when you had people pay attention, the attention network was active. When you had people rest, this other network, this orangey-yellow network, was more active. Right? So, and then they were what we call anti-correlated. When one was up, the other one was down. So when you were resting, there was this activity, and attention was down, and then it flipped. So the question was, well, what is going on with this rest network? I mean, rest is supposed to be some kind of baseline, but something is happening during rest that's reliable enough that we're picking up this very identifiable neural network. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so one idea from just asking participants in the scanner, what is it that you're doing when you are told to rest? And these are mostly undergrads that are come in, and they'd say things like, well, I'm like making my to-do list, or I'm thinking about how boring this is, or why did I decide to pick this experiment, or this is really uncomfortable. I mean, they're going through essentially what could be characterized as mind wandering, right? So they're kind of all over the place, but they're wandering. And so with that hunch, some other colleagues decided to do, Kalina Christoph at University of British Columbia did a project in which she asked people to pay attention. She did a very attentionally demanding task during brain imaging. So it was an attention task. But she sort of gave them an out. She said, look, this is an attention demanding task. You should really be paying attention to do it. But if you happen to mind wander, just press this button, let us know. Right? So then we've got these measures of they're on task, and then when they themselves report that they were wandering away. And what she found was that when they were on task, that blue circuit, that frontal parietal circuit of attention was activated. And when they said they were wandering, that orange-yellow circuit was activated. Okay, so now we got a clue, okay, this is tied to mind wandering. So that's kind of like interesting. Okay, we have a circuit that's tied to mind wandering, but mind wandering itself is like got a lot of different things that could be part of it. And so again, kind of going through this history lesson of neuroscience, one of the hunches was, in all these reports that people are giving of mind wandering, there seems to be something in common about what they're doing, which is that it always has to do with themselves. It's like, I don't feel good, I'm going to do this, I'm that, or I want this to happen, whatever it is, self is always sort of the main character of the story. So to test out this idea, scientists did a study, some other folks did a study, if you could go to the next slide, where they just directly looked to see if they could activate this circuit when they had people do self-related processing. Okay, so the experiment was, you basically see a series of adjectives, and you say, how well does this word describe? And then under certain blocks, you say, you, the person, the participant. And in other blocks, you'd say, some famous person, let's say Bill Clinton. Right? So, and what they found in these studies was that reliably, when self was the target of the evaluation, that same circuit was activated. Okay, so now we got a sense of what this mind-wandering circuit may be about and kind of what it's presenting itself at as default. In fact, this idea has really, if you could go to the next slide, kind of let people rethink what rest even means, right? They now think of it as really rapid, ever-present, self-related thinking. So, I don't know about you guys, but it's not all that restful to do that. So that was that is sort of by way of saying that, through the course of finding these circuits activated, we got a little bit of insight into what parts of the brain are active during mind wandering and what the nature of that wandering is. So the prominent feature of all of this is that in most of our brains, if we're asked to rest, maybe not in this crowd, but most other people for whom contemplative practice is not a big part of their daily life, during rest, this circuit would be activated. So recently, contemplative neuroscientists have started asking the question, may it be possible to change the way the brain functions sort of by default if you are engaging in practices that really address this issue of mind wandering and address the issue of having self as the prominent player in all of your mental activity? So if you could go to the next slide. First of all, to just say, yes, why is it that mind wandering occurs? It happens to be by default. And we can talk a little bit during the discussion of some of the kind of evolutionary perspectives on why it is that the brain might cycle through and have this as a default of what it does. So when we go on to what I was just saying earlier, that questions now have emerged around what we can do about it, mindfulness training, contemplative training comes up as a really good potential way by which we may change this mind-wandering default of the human mind. Next slide, please. Some exciting data that's come up recently by one of my colleagues, Judd Brewer at Yale, is that he actually took a group of long-term mindfulness practitioners and he had them come into the scanner and actually do what was assigned to people that were not practitioners, just rest. He also had them do actual practices in the scanner. And throughout all of that, what he found was that their default mode functioning was actually less when compared to control participants. So that was our first kind of insight that, yeah, maybe we're onto something here in thinking that these practices, especially that idea of sustaining, maintaining, and controlling our mind wandering through something like mindfulness of breathing, may be strengthening our ability to control mind wandering, and we see indices of that in brain functioning. Next slide, please. So, that's great. We can look directly at the brain, but we don't really know by just looking at the brain what's happening in terms of the functional or performance benefits of reducing mind wandering, right? We don't know from the brain alone. The brain is not telling us anything about performance. So one of the questions that I had was, how can we actually ask this question by indexing something about their behavior? As I said at the outset, the bad side, the downside of mind wandering is that it makes your performance suffer. People don't do as well on all kinds of tasks that are attentionally demanding if they're wandering away. So if you could go to the next slide. So this is kind of a challenge now if you want to bring this to a laboratory measure of behavior. Because think about what I'm trying to do. I'm basically saying, I want people to come into my lab. My whole question is around mind wandering. I want people to come into my lab, and then I want for them to, on cue, not do what I tell them. All right? It's a little bit tricky. So we thought a lot about how to do this, and then we basically realized, oh, it's not that hard. All you got to do is bore them. And so if you bore them, they will wander, right? I mean, if I started droning on and kind of put you to sleep, you would happily wander, right? So we know this. So the way we did this in the laboratory is really devised the world's most boring task called the sustained attention to response task, which is very simple. They come into the lab, they sit in front of the computer screen, and they look at the screen. On the screen, they will see a single number. And their job is to press the button every time they see a number. Then they see another number, press the button. Another number, press the button. Really boring. The only catch is that every now and then, you might see the number 3. And if you happen to, don't press the button. Okay? So what people pretty quickly fall into is the mind-wandering pattern, and sure enough, soon they'll press to the 3 with the, oh, God, that kind of a response. So in addition to seeing by their performance when they were mind-wandering, we actually asked them directly. We stopped the experiment and probed them by asking them, just with one question, are you on task? How on task are you? And they gave us a range of, 1, I'm really on task, or 6, I'm not on task at all, I'm off task. So that gave us a sense of their subjective experience going through this, of how much they felt that they were wandering. Next slide, please. And what we wanted to do is really start out by saying, it was great that Judd saw these beautiful decreases in this default mode brain activity when he had long-term contemplative practitioners come into the lab and did their brain scanning. But really the question comes up, were these people different to begin with? Is there something about choosing to be a meditator that might be because your brain and your functioning is different? So, and that's always a challenge we get anytime we show data from long-term practitioners. So what we wanted to do is essentially not have that be a challenge to us. So we recruited people, novices that had no experience, but no interest really specifically in learning about mindfulness. And we involved them into a healthy living study where half the group got a nutrition education course and another half the group got a mindfulness training course. Both courses were about 8 weeks, taught by experts that were passionate about their topic. And after the end of the course, everybody that took their course said, I really benefited from this course. Right? So it was successful in that we matched as many dimensions as possible. But our hunch was that the nutrition education course would not strengthen this ability to control mind wandering, whereas the mindfulness training study would. And so what we did is offer these participants in both groups this boring SART experiment, sustained attention response task, before the training and then after the training. And we're looking to see how they did. You guys following me? Okay. So now the thing is that experiment itself is very long. It is about 20 minutes long. And so, we even were interested in seeing, well, maybe mindfulness will be helpful, but it might not help for the entire 20 minutes. I mean, these are people are novices, they're learning for only 8 weeks. But let's see how they do on this task. And maybe we'll probe further on, like, if it helps on some, maybe the first portion and they kind of conk out at the end. That was sort of our intention going into it. Next slide, please. And so what I'm showing you here are the data from that project, and this is just the accuracy, how well they were at actually doing the task correctly, pressing the button when it wasn't a 3, withholding when it was a 3. And the gray bars are showing you what the data looked like before they were trained, just time 1 before they get training. We've got the nutrition education group on one side and the mindfulness group on the other. The black bars are showing you what happens after the course is over. And what we saw was that the mindfulness group significantly improved in their ability to do this task. But more striking to me was not just that overall there's an improvement, but that really this improvement is very strong for the first half of the experiment. By the second half of the experiment, they're kind of back down to what the other group was like. But this was very encouraging. It seems to be the case that if you offer people training that emphasizes control of attention and control of mind wandering in behavioral laboratory tasks, we're able to see evidence that they're really better at doing this. So it's very encouraging. But we were left with a lot of questions. And in particular, we were wondering, if 8 weeks helps, does more help beyond that? Can you help people benefit in their capacity to control mind wandering for the entire 20 minutes instead of the just first 10 minutes, for example? But to answer this question, we decided we weren't going to simply take an 8-week course and turn it into a 16-week course, but we were going to try a different strategy, more like an intensive training strategy. If you go to the next slide. And so it was really, intensive mindfulness training in experienced meditators result in prolonged benefits over the entire task. So now we're going to take people that already have some kind of long-term practice and then set them up to go to some intensive training and see if it really can help. Right? The prediction was that would be a strong case, that it's a stronger dose, if you will, of mindfulness training relative to this 8-week course. So what we did, if you can go to the next slide, this is where my, again, appreciation and gratitude to working with Naropa comes in. There's a beautiful lady there you might recognize, Jane Carpenter. And this was actually a partnership with Shambhala Mountain Center, Naropa, and my lab, where we recruited folks that were attending the 1-month Dhatu at the Shambhala Mountain Center. So this was an intensive 1-month retreat where they were engaging in varieties of practice for long periods throughout the day for the entire month. Right? So what our hunch was that doing this practice may actually also reduce mind wandering. Next slide, please. And I'm happy to report it did, right? This would be very sad if I came here and said, sorry, 1 month, but no help. So the retreat group at time 2 significantly improved, and it looks very robust relative to what I showed you with the 8-week course group. Next slide, please. And if we kind of do a head-to-head, where I'm looking at the novices that got 8 weeks of mindfulness, and we divvy it up as the first half of the experiment and the second half of the experiment, we'll see that the first half actually looks good for the novices, looks good for the retreatants, but the second half shows a maintained improvement for the retreatants. So our hunch is going into it that there may be some kind of dose-response effect. The more you practice, whether it's part of a long-term practice and then an intensive training on top of that, or whatever form it may be in this case it was that, we might find that the behavioral metrics that suggest improvement are in line with our predictions. Next slide, please. All right, so we're back to the take-home message. You made it to the end. And what I've told you is essentially that this idea of mind wandering is part of the way that our brain seems to function by default. And the self as the central character in that ongoing activity in the mind is prominent. But that there seems to be a way, because mind wandering tends to be so problematic for our performance and our mood and even potentially our lifespan, that there is something we can do about it. We can engage in contemplative training that might help strengthen our capacity to control our own mind wandering. And what we've found is that indeed, not only do we see brain changes that reflect that, but we see performance improvements that suggest that people are better able to do it. Next slide, please. So I want to just end by thanking all the people that allowed us to do this, and again, highlighting my wonderful collaboration with Jane on this effort. And then, next slide. I want to just end by thanking you for your attention. So, does anybody have any questions? Do we have some time for that? Yeah. Oh, microphone. Okay, great.
I noticed in your group, both control and retreat, you mentioned it looked like a number of females. Were most or all of your subjects females? Or?
No, we always put only one gender when we identify the composition, and we did look at gender differences. There were none.
Okay, great.
I work with people who have brain injury, and I'm wondering if inhibition and initiation are actually comparable when you look at the scans and see what's going on.
Inhibition and
initiation.
I guess I don't know what you mean by initiation.
Being able to initiate a response.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Particularly when you ask the question, what are you experiencing? What are you thinking of? Are you actually seeing something happen? That is initiation.
I see. So I think your question is around if people with certain types of brain injury, would that show up in the way that their brain scans would look around these two dimensions, right?
Around these two dimensions,
yeah.
Yes.
So I mean, it's a hard kind of broad question to answer. My guess would be that whatever behavioral consequences they're suffering from, there's going to be some brain signature of that, but it would really depend on the specifics if we could pick it up.
I was just wondering if it would be depressed or non-existent or changed.
I mean, there's definitely going to be sensitivity, and typically when people have problems in inhibiting what we tell them to do, it's indexing the activity of this same circuit, this attention circuit. So frontal lobe damage, parietal lobe damage, those regions, if they get damaged, will really cause people to have trouble inhibiting a response.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. I'm thinking about this from an evolutionary viewpoint. And obviously your subjects are living now in this country. And in the early evolution of humans, it was a very different set of conditions where one had to pay attention to all kinds of environmental cues in order to make a livelihood and to survive. So I'm curious what comments you have in terms of your findings and then your thoughts about how this might have played out in the early evolution of humans.
Right. So that's a great question. Thank you. So the idea of the evolutionary perspective is something that people are starting to really think about when it comes to why is it that the brain does this by default? And why is it that there's such a prominent presence of self-related preoccupation? And some of the ideas really are around that even through our evolutionary history, if we look at our ancestors, you're at a watering hole and your intention is to drink the water, but you got to be scanning to make sure you're not going to get eaten. So this idea of having to constantly do multiple things, and of which some have to do with your self-related self-preservation, may be part of the way the brain was designed to ensure our survival. Now, in terms of how that relates to present day, one of the things that is curious, because a lot of people, when I present this data, say, is this a particularly American phenomenon, right? We're like, it's like, it's all about us, me. And it ends up that it's not. So some of the cross-cultural studies that have been done on the rates of mind wandering suggest that it's the same east and west so far has pretty much been it. A large studies done in China, and then across kind of Europe and kind of the United States and Canada.
Are all those studies of modern peoples?
Yeah. So this is all using the same kinds of paradigms and methods that I described.
Thank you.
Sure. Right behind you? Do you want to? Oh, somebody up here.
Thank you for your talk, and mine's more kind of about you're identifying self, and that's like the Buddhist premise of meditation, to not have self and not identify with self. So you're scientifically proving the Buddhist method of meditation, and the fixation on self is really what depletes us and degenerates us. Is that really what you're getting at?
So, this is, I would never use the word prove.
Okay.
But the very exciting aspects of neuroscientists engaging with Buddhism and Buddhist texts is this kind of predictive quality, right? So we think of, at least I will speak for myself, when I see what the Buddhist perspective has to offer, what I see is a really good set of hypotheses. Because what we know for sure is that over the millennia, there's been very careful investigation of the nature of mind. So that helps me say, okay, these are the hunches. It's never my intention, and I would say for most active scientists, to go into it already having a foregone conclusion of what it is that you're gonna find. But it definitely gives us some insight into where we might want to look. And then from that point of view, it does seem to be that there's some convergence on these type of data and a Buddhist perspective.
Well, talking about Tibetan Buddhism, they say that the mind is in the heart center. They locate it there. So I'm just wondering if there's any studies that look not just at this head part, but would look at a more complete body.
I mean, what's interesting is that now some of the work that's being done in that context, so the question is, it may be experienced in that part of the body, right? But it may be that it's in the brain, that part of the body representation is the one that's the target for how somehow some of these practices are having an impact. So some of the questions have to do around, if you look at body maps within somatosensory cortex, is there anything that identifies some body areas as more prominent than others? That's kind of the strategy that many people are taking, plus looking at things like heart rate variability and things like that. So it is considered, because it is a very prominent report that you get. Sure.
about the experiment itself, you said the tests are boring.
Yes.
And I live with somebody who has ADHD and wouldn't do a boring task. It doesn't have value. So did you take into consideration the self-selection of the people that were participating?
Absolutely.
And is there a difference in people's brains that aren't willing to do boring tasks?
I'm sure that they would not have made it through the 8-week training. Because if you think these tasks are boring, try meditating. Right? So, and I'm saying this in all seriousness because we actually did consider that. If you think about it, it seems like a perfect match. Attention is compromised or challenged in many people that suffer from ADHD, ADD. And here we've got something that seems to be strengthening attention. Just put them both together and it'll be fine. But it ends up that the way by which you are able to cultivate a stronger attention system relies on the strength of existing systems that are already potentially compromised in folks that have disorders like ADD. So we actually in my lab did a project where we looked to see how we might be able to help people with ADD. And the strategy we took was to not do it like a standard mindfulness-based stress reduction course, for example, where the first day of class you're sitting for 45 minutes. Instead, this was a collaboration with that I did in a project at the University of Pennsylvania with Michael Boehm, who was our teacher in that. And what he did is he devised training that really involved active practices, so your hunch of if it's boring, I'm not doing it, and very small periods of practice. So that, for example, the first week, their practice was something called bells, in which they'd play an audio recording that would just have a little ding every 10 seconds for like 3 minutes. And that was it. Can you make it between 2 of the dings? How many dings can you get through? And he built them up slowly, slowly, slowly. So by the end of the 8 weeks, I think they were up to 10 or 15 minutes of practice. So that's another consideration, is that you want to make sure whatever you're doing is catering to where the people that you want to work with are at. And that maximizes in the capacities that they have instead of kind of relying on the way it's typically done with people that don't have those issues. Then we've got one over here next, just so both sides get a chance. Hi.
Hi. I was wondering if you could expand upon what particular regions of the brain are being activated when we're mind wandering versus being attentive, and
Sure.
what other functions are correlated with those regions in particular?
Yeah. No, I mean, are you a neuroscientist?
A little bit.
Okay, good. Well, I mean, partly when I give talks like this, I mean, I think people get excited, and there's a lot of data now that says if you put a brain up, people believe anything you say. So knowing that, I really try to not oversell the brain, because I think that, I want to be heard for what I'm saying that's of value. But it ends up that, we know a lot about what these circuits reflect. And of course, the story is more complicated when we get into the weeds of it. So the entire default mode idea is now starting to fractionate around sub-aspects of what is happening by default. So there's sub-regions that have to do with self-related processing and self-evaluation, even things like the narrative self versus the experiential self. There's other aspects of the default mode that have to do with the creation and holding online of autobiographical memory, that have to do with regions like the posterior cingulate and the anterior aspects of the medial temporal cortex. So we can get into parsing those systems. Then there's a whole other set of systems that have to do with affective meaning making, which are more the ventromedial PFC regions. And in fact, what we see is that these ventromedial PFC regions are more online when people are wandering without awareness than with awareness. So just being in the know really suppresses that self-related aspect that gets really hijacked. And we are now, I wouldn't say people, because I would say I'm part of this effort as well. What we're trying to do now is understand how it is that not only the activation profiles, but the interface between activation profiles and structural change might be leading to some of these effects. So I didn't talk about this because, again, I'm going to talk about the brain when needed, but some of the really exciting data has to do with how specific brain structures are more gyrified or crumpled up, which means that they're more efficient in the way that the cells are communicating with each other, and that those regions really have to do with some of the operations that we've been talking about.
Thank you so much for coming. and I really applaud the work that you do. It's always very slippery, I think, to try to bridge science and spirit. And I'm very intrigued by this assertion that the default of the mind, or mind wandering is the default. Because that's really not in resonance with a lot of traditional spiritual assertions. For instance, in much of Buddhist doctrine, it is actually the nature of the mind to be fundamentally present. And the default, the fault that we've grooved ourselves into, perhaps the baseline population that you work with is already a population that has faulted into mindlessness so continuously that that is in fact their default. I'm not sure how you would test this from a scientific point of view, but I think spiritual masters would contest that assertion that the fundamental default is into mind wandering. In fact, their assertion would be the antithesis of that.
I think that's something to think about. I think that all I can tell you is that the default isn't so much into some kind of statement about the ultimate reality about the nature of what mind is. It's how the mind presents itself in most people most of the time. And I would say that from the point of view of the kind of contemplative path that you're talking about, I think that that also fully acknowledges that, because many aspects of what we're being guided to do is to address this aspect of our own mind. So maybe it is the case that the ultimate nature of mind has a different quality than this wandering, self-obsessed nature, but it takes some work to actually uncover that.
Exactly, that's what you're doing. There's two ways to look at it. So you're either training the mind to be mindful, or you're actually discovering and uncovering the aspects of mind that reveal its natural state.
Yeah.
But I think it's dangerous, I think, to just proclaim that this is the default state of the mind. It's actually, my assertion would be that that's not in fact the case. This is the way the mind has been trained. We're fundamentally practicing mindlessness all the time, which is why we're so proficient at it. And you're basically bearing witness to the virtuosity of people who've engaged in this for eons, basically. So I think, there's these proclamations, I think you have to be balanced. They just have to be a little bit careful.
Well, I would constrain the proclamation to simply that from brain imaging data, in most of the cases when we're asking people to just see what they look like, this seems to be a prominent feature.
So one other question, how has this research informed you in your practice? How has it changed you in your life?
I gotta go. See you guys later. This was fun. I would actually say it's the other way around. My journey to studying this came from my own interest in these practices and my own experience with their power. So I would say at this point, it is a really beautiful dance between what I'm uncovering as I progress in my own journey and what I'm trying to uncover in the lab. And there's a lot of back and forth. And I would say that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to promote even in my own lab, is that if you're coming to study the nature of the mind and the brain, you've got to take a phenomenological perspective in addition to this objective perspective that we're using with our instrumentation. We'll go on this side next.
Thank you. This is really, really good. Very, very good. I had one question when I started. All these questions gave me like 600. I'll start with number one now.
Oh,
Looking at
gosh.
the brain scans, I noticed that the blue areas and the orange areas never overlapped.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then also, were you looking at the neurochemical changes in the brain or the neuroelectrical changes in the brain? And also, did you see, I told you a lot of questions,
Yeah,
right?
that's already.
Then did you see blood flow changes in
Okay.
the brain as well?
Okay, so let's stop there so I can answer those. Okay. First, they know neurochemical. This is all blood flow. So the signature that we're looking at in functional MRI is something called the BOLD signal, blood oxygenation level dependent. So in effect, it's not indexing directly the electrical activity of the brain. It's indexing the blood that rushes to a part of the brain as it has metabolic demands because it's more active. Okay, so it's all of that sort. It ends up that if we had a little, if I were going to do 5 more lectures, for example, I would come to the point of sharing with you that it ends up that there is some overlap between the blue areas and the orange areas. And what that story is starting to reveal is that maybe there's even some hijacking, so that when you are actually engaged in this self-related thought, that requires you to maintain certain trains of thought, that you're recruiting attention areas to do that. So that you're able to, you need attention to hold the internal train in the same way you need attention to direct it to the outside world.
Hi.
Hi.
So, talking about cellular longevity and self-preoccupied thinking, what about the juxtaposition of that, of when you think about someone that you love, someone that you're connecting to, so then the endorphins are released in your body, and there's just a different reaction, I think, with the brain and the body with those thoughts versus that repetitive self-thinking. Wouldn't that have a different effect and stimulate a different part of the brain?
I sure hope so.
Not as, with the mind wandering,
Yeah.
it's not as detrimental?
You're asking a great question, right? You're saying that when the nature of what you're thinking about is different, might the whole cascade of what the mind and body experience change? And my prediction is that, yeah, it should, because really we're talking about a system that is very dynamic and sensitive to what it's getting in terms of what it's kind of outputting. And to go back to your specific question, one of the studies that's been done very recently that looks at telomeres, I sort of only told you the downside, right? Which is that, look, if you wander a lot and you've got chronic stress and you're really, you're under chronic stress and you wander a lot, your telomeres are going to look shorter and you're going to have a shorter lifespan. But the other side of it is that it ends up that in a project done recently, actually at Shambhala Mountain Center called the Shamatha Project, with my colleague Cliff Sarin, what they did is they had people, they had a blood lab there, they had a brainwave lab there. They studied these people extensively, and people were recruited into a 3-month retreat. What they found is that they took their blood levels, and they were looking to see, they didn't look at telomeres directly, they looked at something that is a reparative enzyme that helps rebuild telomeres, because that's also part of the deal, is that it's not just like if they shrink, you're out of luck. There is a reparative process, and the presence of how much of this enzyme you have gives you a sense of how much they're going to be able to kind of regenerate that telomere, okay? So what they found is that when people were undergoing this 3-month retreat, the amount of change in well-being, improvement in their subjective sense of well-being corresponded to how much telomerase there was. People with more well-being had more telomerase.
That's
So,
fantastic news.
yeah,
Thank you.
that is good news. It gets me to sit.
I'm wondering if you studied like a regression rate on both of the 8-week and the ones that were in retreat. And by that I mean, right, so they scored really high on that test. How quickly does that decline? Is that different in each group? And what does that say from the standpoint of like neuroplasticity, meaning are you training it enough to where it stays up high enough over a given time?
Yeah.
I hope that made any sense.
No, it totally makes sense. Everybody else get it? Yeah. I think that's a great question, right? It's like, okay, if I'm going to go through and do this 1-month retreat, how long am I good for? It's like, can I stop practicing for a year, or do I got to start? It's sort of like you're asking about the half-life of the benefit. But unfortunately, I mean, that's just sort of not the way the system works. And the brain is really no different than the body, right? So physical activity and mental activity really share a lot of the same features. If we train extensively for a marathon and then decide for an entire year to be a couch potato, there's going to be some enduring benefits, but you're definitely not going to be in the same shape you were as you were training, right? So the more specific question about have we tracked people over the long term is that in these studies we did not, but in some of the studies we're doing now with very short form training, 2 weeks of training, for example, we are tracking to see what happens a month out, 2 months out. And essentially, it's looking like what I would have expected, which is that if you get 2 weeks of training and you look much better than when you started after the 2 weeks, and you stop practicing, you basically go back down to baseline. But if you continue your practice, there does seem to be some maintenance of that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, right there.
Hi, I have a question about individual differences. I mean, you mentioned, I think at the beginning, that there's not much that's that predictive about how one traverses the default mode versus the other mode, but I'm wondering if there's an emerging story about this at all as you start fractionating this more, is there any sort of story in the individual differences? You know, people who traverse one particularly well, do they traverse the other in a more attentive way or some such?
What do you mean by traverse?
Oh, I mean, so
Is that you or me? Let's say it's you.
I'm just wondering, so in terms of, so you're observing individual differences in brain activity, and I'm wondering if there's anything in the individual differences of when one is in one mode that is predictive of how the sorts of activities you see in the other mode.
So if they're in the default mode, is the way that they present when they're in an attentionally demanding mode? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean,
Okay. So
it correlates.
yes. So I would say that is sort of one of the next frontiers of looking at this. Is that there was really no interest in starting to look at individual differences till we had a handle on there's some signatures that we can really see in this data. So now we can look at things like personality variables, personal history, all kinds of things that might suggest to us that there's some differences in the way people basically even come to practice and how they benefit. But with regard to the interrelationship between default mode and attentional mode, yes, that's what's kind of exciting. Even in Judd Brewer's paper, he was starting to pick that up, is that, but it wasn't really an individual differences issue. It was more just it was more around how easily they flipped between the two modes. So I mean, that's a kind of a longer story, but I get your point, which is that yes, it's a good way to go, and that's sort of the next layer of what we want to investigate. Hi, Valerie.
Hi, Amishi. Good to see you again.
Yes.
I have a question about traumatic brain injury, which may relate a little bit to this question you already answered about ADHD. I'm wondering if you've compared mindfulness training with some of the cognitive rehab techniques that are done for attention retraining in veterans with TBI, and if you could talk a little bit about your work with the military.
Happy to, yeah. So the short answer is no, we haven't done that yet. One of the challenges of comparing something like a computer-based training to mindfulness training is that most mindfulness training programs, especially as we've offered them, are in a group context with psychosocial support. So it ends up that we think that would be such an overwhelming contributing factor to the benefits that we now have to come up essentially with, and we're trying to figure out how to do this, so you and I will chat about, maybe you have some ideas for me. But how is it that you can have psychosocial support in the context of people doing computer-based attention tasks, attention training, right? So lumosity, but you come together and you talk about something that is anchoring you to that. So matching for those dimensions is absolutely critical. And I think the more innovative strategies are going to be sort of figuring out what helps whom when. So it may be that attention training or some kind of cognitive augmentation type of training may be helpful at certain stages, but maybe not others, depending on the type of, so this customization, right? So the kind of individualized medicine would be a strategy to think about. Most of the work that we've done in the military context has actually not been with veterans, it's been with active duty service members. So our strategy has been to, well, in effect, they're all veterans. I mean, in the sense that they've been to combat and back. Most of them had an average of 4 prior deployments. But our intention was to see if offering them mindfulness training might help them better, well, wander less, improve their attention, so that they're better able to hold their own ethical code of how to behave while they're deployed. And that motivation came from the data that's shown us that when people come back and have psychological injury, so PTSD, depression, suicidality, anxiety, kind of lump them all together. If they come back and are diagnosed with something, they're 3 times more likely to say that they engaged in unethical behavior while they were deployed. So there's something about not being able to behave in a way that's aligned with what they know to be right that is compromising the kind of, and promoting the cascade of psychological injury. And so the intention was to see if we could grow attention. Could we grow reductions in mind wandering? Could we grow working memory capacity? Which are all kind of the raw materials we need to know how we want to behave and hold that at the front of our mind as we face adversity. So that's that work.
Please come back and give us another talk.
Thanks.
One question I have is, could the equipment that you work with have an influence? Because if I were in a tube like that for a while, and somebody would sell me breast for 5 minutes,
Forget it.
I could see my mind racing, trying to get out of there. I mean, there's just a physiological impact of being in a tube like that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, for sure. I mean,
And does
it's
that not-
claustrophobic making, if
Yeah,
nothing else.
yeah. So it's almost easier to put your attention on something while you're in that experiment than being told to rest. That would, rise my stress levels.
Yeah. So other technologies that don't require being in a tight tube that's really loud also show corresponding similarities. So if you put a brainwave cap on people, you see electrical signatures that seem like they're reflecting the same processes. Or you have somebody do a PET scan where they're being injected with a radioactive tracer and it's quiet and they're laying down, same kind of neural signature.
This is related to the question about regeneration, and I'm curious about your experience with the brain's ability to regenerate or plasticity and trauma. So in mindfulness practice, influence on rebuilding after trauma.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that it's a really exciting possibility. And it's all kinds of trauma, right? So actually we were approached by a high school football coach, who wanted to see if he could start giving players who were going to be playing football mindfulness training, not only to help their play, but maybe it may be brain protective. So if they get a concussive injury, maybe they won't suffer as much. So those types of strategies, I think, are not strategies, but contexts are going to be very interesting to look at. People are starting to look to see if they can help folks that have suffered from traumatic brain injury using mindfulness. The considerations are the same as we were mentioning earlier as ADHD, which is that you have to teach it in a way that relies on the hardware that's still healthy.
And specifically, what about psychological trauma?
Psychological trauma is a little bit trickier. I mean, there's certain circumstances under which people would say it's contraindicated, and that the care that would be taken has to be by a very experienced clinician, so that they're not. Typically, it's not done in a group setting, but for sure, it's being used in all kinds of contexts in which people are suffering from even things like PTSD in the veteran context with success. But if I had to just say in mass, if should you just try it if you experience something traumatic, I would say take care, take a lot of care.
Your example about the football coach actually goes really well into my question. I read an article last year called Beyond Mindfulness, and I was very interested in that because one phrase from it was, "But the rush to secularize and commodify mindfulness into a marketable technique may be leading to an unfortunate denaturing of this ancient practice." And so you were really at the forefront.
I am. That article is all about me.
But you definitely are the person that comes to mind for applied research with mindfulness.
That's right. So
have you gotten flack from representatives in the Buddhist community or anything like that?
Yeah. And I'm doing it anyway. And I say my strategy is that if the criticism is that enough care is not being taken, and that considerations of the Dharma and real partnership with Buddhists is not brought into the conversation, the solution to that is to have Buddhists join the conversation instead of saying that what we're doing is not worthy. Because my basic point of view is that all beings are worthy of getting the opportunity to reduce their suffering. So the strategy that we take is going to be one that we think is going to be, I mean, if you want to help 1 billion people, you might not be able to send them on a 3-month retreat. But what could you do that might help them even this much? And that's kind of the spirit of the work that we're doing. And my response to criticism that I get is, come on over, join our team, show us. What is it that we could do that you think would align better with your view of what the right way might be, the healthy way, the informed way? And I'm very happy to say that even in the context of the military work, we're partnering with what you'd call mainstream Buddhists or hardline Buddhists even. So I'm okay with that criticism, but I want with it an openness to try to collaborate. I don't know where the mic is. Is there somebody have one? There's a question over here.
Yeah, it's coming your way.
Okay.
So I'm just kind of curious about mind wandering, and it kind of goes off the evolutionary question and kind of being sensitive.
I'm sorry, can you say the last sentence again? I couldn't hear you.
It kind of goes off, okay, there I am. It kind of goes off the evolutionary question and sensitive to what's trying to be achieved. I'm curious as to if there were negative aspects of over practice, or because mind wandering to me seems to have some beneficial qualities. Like if I was sitting here and all of a sudden, oh, I forgot to pick my mom up at the airport.
You should go. Yeah.
Right. So we're trying to distinguish between are these thoughts that are happening useful to this current situation,
right,
or these preoccupied thoughts, and is there, by over practice, is there some sort of repression that can occur?
I think that's an important question. That's the first thing I'll say, is that what the consequences, the idea of this whole mindfulness kind of concept or challenge is also starting to bleed into this view of mindfulness and contemplative practice, is that me? As a panacea, right? So it's good for everything. Everybody should do it all the time. Every chance you get, go practice. It's a very bizarre view of, or kind of a zeitgeist almost. So I think that great care needs to be taken on seeing whom and under what supervision and in what way should they be guided. We have to go into it with our eyes open, not to say that it's all good for everybody and that's it. So I think that that's still going to be something that, and there are some projects like the Dark Night Project. There's some projects that are actually looking to see what happens when you actually go to this point of maybe even dissolving self. Are there certain age ranges and developmental trajectories under which, or people with certain psychological illnesses that should not try to dissolve self because it would really be destabilizing and cause dissociative states, and then that would be bad. But the level that we're talking about, which is essentially healthy individuals practicing in a pretty modest amount of practice of mindfulness exercises, is that the intention is that you're better able to be aware, even if you choose to wander, that you are wandering, so that you can make best use of your attentional capacity in the service of what you're trying to achieve. So it's not saying never wander. It's saying if you're wandering, know that that's what's happening instead of being kind of caught by it. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say about that. So there's a question up here too. Yeah. Sorry. Next. Yeah.
Thank you. It seems like the mindfulness practice that you're utilizing in your experiments is a very basic mindfulness approach, which goes to, it's clearly fundamental to a lot of traditions, and it allows you to work easily with a lot of people. I'm wondering whether you are planning to move towards experimenting with other practices. There are a lot of practices within Buddhism, and certainly a lot of practices across different spiritual traditions that might be more effective in accomplishing what you're moving towards. So I'm wondering whether that's part of...
What do you have in mind?
We can talk about that later.
Yes. In fact, the starting point of that is bandwidth for me. I would want to do all of it. So it's like, what can we do, and how can we engage in a research strategy that will result in a productive answer, right? Which takes several iterations, even with the stuff that we're doing with something like mindfulness-based stress reduction. But even today, actually, Jane and I have been already talking about some of the kinds of practices, the kinds of contexts in which we might see things that are not part of what, for example, mindfulness-based stress reduction is. And I absolutely think that that's going to be the case. One big area that I'm very interested in moving into, and that we've been moving into a little bit in the context of working with military spouses, is, for example, complementing kind of a foreground of concentrative and mindfulness practices with then the bulk of the training emphasizing compassion. So, you know, when we look at, and what's really interesting is that after the spouses start doing it, after the wives start doing it, the husbands are nudging for the CDs. So now we might be actually getting back to the service member side, offering compassion through the spouses. So it becomes kind of a very interesting thing that happens. But absolutely, and even more what I would call maybe esoteric practices that are not kind of available to most lay secular contexts would be very interesting to look at.
Well, you're in a fantastic position to do R&D on what's most effective from the perspective of the actual measurements you're doing. It's really incredible work you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
So maybe we'll have this be the last question.
Okay.
Hi, so I'm really interested in the social engagement system and interpersonal relationships, and kind of wondering if there's any studies around that. It sounds like a lot of studies so far are kind of on an individual basis, and I can see it being more difficult studying interpersonal relationships. I'm just wondering how where we can have more attention by engaging with each other, and if there's any studies around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's an area that I'm very interested in going into as well. One of the things that we want to do in the context of even the spouse project that I was mentioning is to look at how one member of a family, like a spouse, meaning a mother, might impact the family cohesion and therefore like the family psychological health. So that level of within a family structure, how mindfulness training might have an impact and compassion practices might have an impact. We're also looking at things like leadership. And how is it that if you actually provide mindfulness training to leaders, how does that impact their relationship with subordinates and then the culture of the enterprise? So absolutely, I think it's an exciting area to think about, because then it's almost like you get, kind of like more bang for the buck, so to speak. And if you could really seed it kind of can have its own growth through the network itself. All right, thank you.